Art shows in northern Saskatchewan is a very new step to acknowledging and appreciating artists in the north. Sherry Farrell Reset, an artist and one of the adjudicators for the Larange Art Show, speaks on her area of expertise. The community of Larange and the northern artists welcome her knowledge as she passes on what she has learned. Sherry attempts to answer the difficult question of what it means to be a traditional artist.
We do need to think about it because I think for a long time we just thought about it in terms of medium. So if you were working with beads, you were working in a, as a traditional artist. They're starting to differentiate between contemporary beadwork and traditional beadwork. And there's certain criteria whether you're showing as a traditional artist or as someone who's working in some traditional medium. So for example, if you're working as a traditional beadworker, then the criteria might be hand tanned hide. So it might have to do with the palette, it might have to do with the style. Because what what we see now is that a lot of northern beadworkers are producing beadwork that's very similar to what we might see in the south. People are being influenced by what they're seeing everywhere, as they always have. Like I look at beadwork and I'll say, oh, well, that's not very traditional. And then look at the floral work and say, well, that's more traditional. But there was a time when that was new as well. And that was an influence that was brought in from somewhere else as well.
Traditional art becomes alive as it reflects the artist's environment and the pace of an era. This artwork has layers and layers of stories that one must decipher for themselves. To begin to understand the history of this art form, we must look back to the roots of it.
Some of the earliest work on hide is painting. And what people seem to have done is using paint and bone tools, incised lines in the leather, but really fairly complex compositions made up of geometric designs, and then those areas would be filled in with bright colors, yellow, red, really quite bright blue, and then porcupine quill work.
Upon her research, Sherry studies ancient garments belonging mainly to Métis and Cree.
One of the things that you see in Cree work, right from the painted coats to beaded hoods that were worn, I'm not sure how widely they were worn in northern Saskatchewan, but they were very common around the bay. And these are these hoods that were worn by women. I think they were once worn right across Cree territory, because they turn up in archaeological sites. And on the bands of beadwork on Cree women's hoods, there's 3 bands of beadwork. So just there's certain aesthetic practices. For Métis people, for example, floral work tended to differentiate Métis people, certain cuts of clothing. And I know that a lot of elders will tell you, too, that there are stylistic elements that would mark a community or even a family. A certain design that was, primarily learned and used by the women in a family. Sometimes there's work that will mark one artist, that one artist will have a design or an approach. And so that after a while, you can say, I recognize that artist's work. Now when I look at beadwork, if I see a blue and white border along a moccasin vamp that sort of alternates white and blue, right away I'm thinking West Side. That's Isle La Crosse, that's Beauval, that's that whole region. That you notice that's kind of a design element that people use that became popular and now kind of marks the beadwork of that region, because I've seen that in at least the work of, at least 4 or 5 artists. So, that becomes a signifier. So you have signifiers of individual artists, you have signifiers of communities, and then you have signifiers of entire groups of people. Those signifiers aren't static. They'll persist over time periods, but they'll also change because people just didn't mindlessly repeat what their ancestors did. I mean, our ancestors were imaginative. They were influenced by other things. They'd see something new. They'd look at something new in the Hudson's Bay story. They'd incorporate it. They'd invent things, and they'd try something new. So floral beadwork that is generally seen to be traditional across the north was once something new. It was a new fashion. It was a new fashion trend. And say in 1850, that would have been associated primarily with Métis people. Now it's associated with Cree, Dene, Northern Cree, Northern Dene, and Northern Ojibwe, and Métis. So you have 4 groups that are operating within that.
One of the oldest garment forms still serves its purpose for Northerners.
Mittens are probably one of the most ancient garment forms in North America, because you find the Europeans describing them, and they're saying they're going to great lengths to describe a mitten. So it's obvious they've never seen them before. And they're like, they're a fingerless glove, and they'll go, on at some length, and you're like, it's a mitt. Like, how hard is this? But obviously, for the person who's going to read what they're writing, this person has never seen a mitten before. And so they would put them on, on a string and have the mitten there. And you can still see them. You can see them at the Trappers Festival. People still wear them. But, most people don't think, oh, I'm going to slip my hands into a 5,000-year-old garment here, because it's still functional for the environment. There's a lot of those in museums, because anyone who came to live in Northern Canada, you had to have that kind of clothing in order to survive. So there's a lot of old, very traditional Cree clothing that was actually worn by fur traders who took it home. Like those leather coats, mittens, pointed toe moccasins, that kind of stuff. And those small bags that people used to keep their fire tackle in, because that was the essence of survival. If you didn't have that stuff, you froze to death. And then you'd make those things beautiful as well. And I find it amazing that people living in really harsh conditions, without light, without all of the modern things that we have, with very limited light, that's probably the thing that amazes me the most, is how limited the light would be, had, took the trouble to beautifully decorate. What they were able to do with basically 2 or 3 mediums was quite amazing. They might have 3 or 4 ways of working with porcupine quill. Like there was netting, there was wrapping, there was the applique, where it was sort of braided back and forth, and then there was loom work. And so Northern people did all of those. So they would use something like a porcupine quill in 5 different ways, 5 different techniques.
Materials of the environment were used for artistic supplies. For the artists, supplies came from their environment, and when new supplies came from foreign lands, the artwork changed its look and feel.
Well, beads were introduced fairly early, among some of the first trade goods. And the beads that were available, even say 100 years ago, seem to have been a lot smaller than the beads that people use now. So if you look at beadwork that was created in, say, 1870 and compare it to the beadwork that's being made now, even the beadwork that was being done in 1970 and the beadwork that's being now, some of the things that impact that is the quality of the beads, the quality of the goods that are available, the size of the beads. So the really early beadwork, the beads were really tiny, they were really even in quality, and they were strung on fine strands of sinew. So the beads were so small you couldn't put a needle through them.
Although there are many differences in style, color, and design through the vast stretch of time and through various influences, Sherry speaks on similarities.
I've seen a pair of dolls that were collected in James Bay wearing a particular style of clothing, and then saw a drawing from 1822 from Cumberland House, and the women in the drawing were wearing the same kind of clothing as these little dolls that were collected in the sort of late 1700s. So that must have been a style of dress or style of clothing, and then there's a description of women in York Factory. So I think across that band of Cree territory, people were dressing fairly similarly. And they all talk about the sort of the quill work. They talk about the painting, but they also talk about the quill work. When you look at the older, like I'm thinking 18th century, 1700s, there was no horsehair then. What you would see in terms of hair would be deer hair or moose hair. So sometimes at the end of a tassel, you'll have a little bit of a fine hair that's dyed usually red. And then I've also seen that where it's finely split leather that's painted red. The early finger weaving was done with unraveled blankets, because they didn't sell like yarn in a ball and say, make yourself a sash. People got the wool and noticed that it would fray and thought, this is neat stuff. They started unraveling it, and they just played with it and did different things with it. When I look at the quality of the very old work, and if you want to emulate it, then you basically need to be able to use what the artists of long ago used. People had a fairly extensive trade network so that people could get natural dyes and products and move them right across the continent, and they did that. And the Cree were involved extensively in sort of transcontinental trade. The fur trade did some really interesting things too, because it moved people right across the continent. So the distances that people traveled, like we think, oh, it's a modern world, we got cars and planes, and we travel way more than our ancestors did. We didn't. People are being employed, at different fur trade posts. They're working in the York Boat Brigades, they work in the Athabasca Brigade one year, they work for the Saskatchewan Brigade another year. And you look at the kinds of fire bags, for example, that they're wearing, then they're all shopping. Basically, the Hudson's Bay Company had a monopoly. So what they had is what people, could buy. And so you have kind of that sort of sameness. And then you've got that amazing influence. So you've got, a painting in 1840, of someone with a fire bag that's identical to the fire bag that the elder made as an example in the 1970s in La Ronge. So this is something that an elder in La Ronge remembered, this particular style of fire bag. So for me, I'm going, okay, that's the same as the fire bag that I saw from Fort Chip. That's the same thing as the fire bag that was given to this guy in 1850. This is the same style as the fire bag that was collected in 1841.
Business during the fur trade was a big influence, which shaped the look of arts then.
Ojibwe people liked red. So that's something the fur traders had to figure out, because they come in with certain goods. And I found letters saying, oh, don't even bother trying to sell silver to these Cree. They don't like it. Then save the red, ship the red to somebody else. But these people only want this color. So they weren't totally at the mercy of the fur traders. They would refuse to buy stuff.
Some even became entrepreneurs and traders themselves.
In my research, I found a lot of Métis people working as itinerant workers and trappers and, just doing some trading around Fort Union, Fort Benton, like all in the American areas where we tend not to think, we mentally create this border that didn't exist during our ancestors' time. These guys aren't getting beads in the States and then taking them up and selling them. And then, because I know that there's, in some of the memoirs that were made by some of the elders at the turn of the century, and they must have been buying the goods with something. So, and I think one of the things that they mentioned was American goods, but they don't say what kind of American goods, but taking stuff that the people need up there, taking the clothing as exchange. So in some cases, decorative objects were currency. People were really, there was like a traffic in decorative objects. They were part of the economy.
Traditional art was used as money in past days and was an important part of the economy.
But there was a free trade movement because the Hudson's Bay Company dominated the trade. And it was actually Louis Riel Sr. and a couple of other, Guillaume Serre, a couple of other Métis men who got caught smuggling into the United States, and the Hudson's Bay Company put them on trial, and about 200 Métis men surrounded what was being used as the courthouse, armed, created quite a ruckus, and even though they were found guilty, they couldn't sentence them. They didn't have the power to impose their law. And so at that point, they all started cheering, and this is a matter of historical record. Also, all these guys are cheering outside, shooting their guns off, going, "La commerce est libre," free trade. Business is wide open. And so what they were doing is they were taking their furs and they were selling them to a more competitive market.
After that, the doors to business became wide and the journey more independent. The traditional artists must have been busier due to bigger markets and the larger and more varied the supplies to work with.
There might have been more men making things than we think, because something like making moccasins, a lot of men knew how to make moccasins, because basically if you couldn't make moccasins, you didn't have anything to wear on your feet. So if you're a trapper, a hunter, someone who's living out on the land, almost, a lot of people could turn their hand to almost anything. So, I mean, there were women who could hunt and make, do all of that stuff because sometimes they had to. But generally, making clothing and doing beadwork and quillwork was seen to be a woman's art. And so if you look, say, at the older generation of artists who are the master crafts people of a particular generation, then almost always, with very few exceptions, those will be women. Now, it's very interesting that among the younger generation, some of the best beadwork is being done by men. And that's really interesting, that some of the best beadwork is being done by men.
The gender of traditional artists have changed from historical times. Adam Dayan, a young man with many roles and duties, does not fit the stereotype of a traditional artist, but he continues his work as it is important in his life.
You know, beading is not only for women, it's a fine art, and it's practiced amongst you know, Native North Americans right across North America, not only here in northern Saskatchewan, but as well in the far United States, you know, right across the whole continent. Most of the dancers I've spoken with make their own regalia. Like, they actually sit down and they bead their own vests, their own moccasins. They put together their own feather work, you know, and this is really good to hear that. So that really gave me a big boost and an encouragement to get on my 2 feet and make my own dance regalia. And that's where it started. So to really get a start on making the dance regalia, I'd sit down with my mother, and she would teach me, this is how you do this kind of stitch, or this is how you put this together. And you know, it's pure sheer determination and the will to actually want to be a dancer that really got me through making my regalia. And it's a good feeling. It's very rewarding. I used to go around telling people, hey, you know, I do my own work. I beaded this, I beaded that. People would look at me and say, you know, I think you're lying, because beading is only for women.
It takes strength to go through the obstacles of stereotyping, and Adam receives his strength from his parents.
Yeah, your nanny does, and so sometimes you see like maklak.
My mother bringing me up gave me the proper tools to communicate and get along with people in everyday life. You know, one thing my dad always used to tell me growing up was never judge people, no matter what they look like or what they say to you.
The design and colors of his regalia comes from his environment, and half of his regalia comes from the natural environment.
I often reflect back on my experiences in the military, and there's a lot of good benefits that I've gotten from the military, good habits, both mentally and physically.
Adam's design and colors are influenced by his environment and his experiences. Adam continues to work at his home on his artwork between his schoolwork and other duties.
I think the thing that bothers me the most about how traditional artists are treated is how their work is undervalued. Their work is really undervalued, and we've got a long way before artists working in traditional medium are treated the same way that a painter is. And it seems that the importance of the artist in creating traditional work, it's like the artist is irrelevant. As soon as the piece is purchased or the piece is in a store, you can go in and say, well, who's the artist? They don't know. You know, you say, oh, some old lady, you know, oh, that's useful. So how can you study an artist? How can you, you know, do a retrospective of a woman's work when the artist herself may not have, you know, it's all sold, it's all gone. She doesn't know who has it. And the work isn't signed. So that's something I'd like to see traditional artists think about doing, finding some way of signing or marking their pieces so that, you know, their children or anyone who's interested in studying their work could say, oh, look, you know, that's so-and-so's because there's their mark, because jewelers do that. You know, artists do that. They sign and date their work. And it makes it possible for someone to come along and kind of reconstruct their career and study their work. But it's very difficult to actually study the work of a traditional artist, especially if they've passed away.
Although the voice of traditional artists may be quiet over the decades, their work speaks for themselves.
Trinaki, do divida. Do di hoshe, bagala tare,